There are moments in life that arrive disguised as ordinary, as the kind of small, almost forgettable things you think you can tuck away and never return to, like a ticket stub folded into the pocket of an old coat. Until one day you empty that pocket and the memory unfolds and floods you with more than the event itself ever deserved. I told myself for years that I liked women the way a weathered sailor believes in the existence of land, as a practical truth, something familiar and expected, something that made life mapeable. I had relationships that were polite and decent and quiet in their dissipation. They taught me how to make tea the way another person preferred, how to fold sheets so the corners matched, how to listen without feeling moved to speak. They did not teach me how to love someone until I was unaccountably awake at 2 in the morning thinking about the way someone tucked their chin against my shoulder and feeling a small, dangerous lift in my chest that I neither asked for nor could control. It started in the autumn when the light turned brittle and the city smelled of damp concrete and browned leaves, when I was still convinced that my life would continue in the same comfortable arc. I had moved to that neighborhood because I liked the old brick buildings, the way stoops created little private stages where people pretended not to watch each other. I had an apartment that overlooked a narrow courtyard and a friend named Aaron who believed, with the stubborn confidence of people who wore kindness like armor, that he could solve everything with food and a steady hand. Aaron was the kind of person who laughed as if it were a physical action, like a cough that shook his shoulders, and who could make a perfect omelet without consulting a recipe. He had been my friend since freshman year, bonded by late-night study sessions and a shared taste for black coffee. He was loud in places I liked and quiet in those I needed, and he would show up on my doorstep with a bag of groceries the moment I mentioned, in passing, that my favorite soup had gone out of season at the corner market. He was, beneath a soft bravado, profoundly tender in a way that sometimes made me ache without a name. Then there was Jonah, who entered our lives like a weather front. He was not violent in his entrance, but sudden nonetheless. An exchange student turned neighbor turned teammate, someone who carried within him a restless kind of charm that scattered any neat assumptions people tried to make about him. Jonah had hair that did whatever gravity allowed it to do, a laugh that was slow and thinking, and a shoulder that could absorb strokes of loudness like pillows absorb light. He played soccer the way some people pray, with a kind of disciplined abandon. And when he was not sprinting across fields or debugging some piece of code, he sat with his sneakers off in our cramped kitchen, his knees up like a chair folded to himself, and talked about his brother with a softness that felt like an apology. We made a kind of household by accident. My place, Aaron said the first night Jonah appeared in our orbit, had the only sofa that seemed to hold gravity. People drifted toward it. So that's where we spent our early evenings. All three of us on a couch that was too big and too small at the same time, the cushions indented with our collective weight. A coffee table laden with mismatched mugs, and a book of photographs I had taken when I thought my life would always be ruled by aesthetic distance. I told myself I was content to observe, to render life into frames and light and composition. I told myself that being the quiet observer was a choice, a tasteful eccentricity, a lens through which I could discover the world without being discovered. Yet I kept the same careful watch that a conservator keeps over a fragile painting, cataloging laughter, noting the way Jonah rubbed the back of his neck when he was nervous, storing away the angled, private smile that Aaron gave when he thought no one was looking. There was ritual before there was ritual. We had dinners that were not quite meals and not quite gatherings, evenings that unfurled on the couch with a certain domestic solemnity as if we were pledging ourselves to some small, unspoken covenant. We shared playlists and a repertoire of jokes that had the weight of inside jokes, and we watched movies in a way that made the sound of our breathing part of the soundtrack. There were nights when we fell asleep like stackable chairs, limbs entangled in the polite geometry of friendship, and mornings when one of us would wake and find someone else already awake and brewing coffee. And that sight felt like a minor miracle. I had loved in my past in ways that never reached toward the edges of what I truly wanted, and so I developed an art for the half-hearted rescue of my own heart. I dated people whose chemistry became predictable and whose departure felt like the removal of a comfortable bandage. I told myself the pattern was merely circumstantial, wrong time, wrong city, wrong alignment of lunars. I did not know, could not have known, that my heart had been waiting for a different kind of ache, one that gathered itself in small gestures and bided its time like tidewater. Jonah was the sort of person who invaded private spaces without knocking because to him there were no rigid doors. He knew how I liked to have light in the afternoon, and he would slide by the window and stand, shoulders pressed against the sills, as if he were trying to take in the sun like an inhalation. Aaron claimed, in that unruffled way of his, that Jonah had a gravitational pull, that you could see people orbit him. I resented the phrase for a moment because I thought I had been doing the orbiting, but then I realized I had been orbiting around a smaller star, a private warmth I had mistaken for distance. The beginning of change was incremental, like the first hairline crack in a pane of glass that widens imperceptibly until the whole thing is different. There was a night after Jonah had been with us for almost 6 weeks where the city had been uncharacteristically cold and Aaron had gone home for the evening. His presence at my place felt like the closing of an umbrella. Jonah and I made a pot of stew that tasted of the paprika he insisted made everything better, and we sat on the couch with our legs tucked under us and our knees almost touching. He reached across to adjust a loose thread on the throw blanket and his hand brushed mine, a small collision that sent a quiet static through my arm. I catalogued that touch like an archivist, the way his thumb lingered on the fabric, the warmth of his palm, the microscopic hesitation before his fingers slid away. I told myself nothing had happened, that it was a domestic movement, nothing more. I held my breath, and in that breath I listened for the sound of my heart making treaties with itself. From then on, the touches multiplied in ways both accidental and deliberate. We shared towels in shifting combinations, sat with our shoulders touching while sorting laundry, and established a policy of open doors and open couches that allowed closeness to exist under a veil of plausible deniability. Jonah would come over after practices with his hair still damp and plunk himself on the sofa, and he would stretch and in the same motion tuck his leg into the crook of mine, as if the movement were entirely unconscious. I catalogued it. I tried to reframe it as kinship, as something athletic men did, as nothing at all. Aaron watched these shifts with an expression like a man reading a map he recognized but did not wish to follow. He never commented directly. He had his own shy kind of restraint that made him watch us with an anxious protectiveness, as if he were making sure the distance between us never collapsed into something that would require a new map and new roads. Sometimes he would leave a plate with leftovers by the door, a silent offering, and in those moments his fingers would linger on the handle longer than necessary. I wondered then whether he saw what I could not yet name in myself and whether his own private calculations were shifting without a word. There was an argument, small and domestic, the kind that felt charged with more than the topic deserved. Aaron, who had a tendency to be late because time seemed to take a holiday whenever he was near someone he liked, missed an evening one week because his ex had called and they had gotten lost in conversation. He called, wincing through the phone, apologizing for the delay and for not being there to watch the documentary we had promised each other. Jonah, who was the sort of person who made brash decisions and then softened at the edges, said casually that he would wait, and then added that he would nap on the couch. I listened to the slits of the conversation and felt my chest tighten like someone had wrapped a cord around it. When Aaron did arrive late, he found Jonah asleep with his head on my lap. The room was dim, and we had all assumed the privacy of the dark like someone nudges a public bench into becoming ours for the night. Aaron laughed, the sound splitting us for an instant, and he set about making more tea, and the three of us settled into a geometry of limbs that felt both precarious and inevitable. The way Aaron rubbed his palms along his fingers betrayed a nervousness he would never own. He complimented my choice of tea, said it smelled like rain on dry ground, and for a moment we existed like a small provisional family. I began to measure the relationship with Jonah by the space between his body and mine, by the silences that folded between our words. I measured the quiet by the way his breathing changed when he spoke of his brother, by the way he let his forehead rest for a second against my shoulder, as if he were checking for a pulse. I had loved in manners that felt tidy. Loving Jonah, and being loved by him in the half-gestures he could not name, felt sprawlingly dangerous and inevitable in equal measure. I asked myself what I had been doing all those years if not rehearsing for this. For Jonah, I learned, the line that separates craving from claim was porous. He often admitted, in the small hours when the city's noise went down to a murmur and the heat in his hands made him fidget with whatever was nearby, that he did not know how to be alone. He described loneliness as a thing with a face that came to his window when he stopped tending the light, and he used metaphors that had the rough sincerity of someone not yet entirely domesticated by words. I listened and listened, because he spoke of need in a way I had only ever assigned to mundanity. The ritual began to name itself. We found, without formality, that we slept more often than not in the same bed when someone had had too much to drink or when rain erased the possibility of going home. We told ourselves reasons that were not reasons. The couch was uncomfortable, the streets were unsafe late at night, the temperature in our apartment held the right kind of warmth that made sleep possible. Over time, the rituals lost their excuses and assumed continuity. Jonah learned that I liked a cool pillow and would steal it without asking. Aaron learned to leave extra mugs in the cupboard, a silent preparedness for whoever might drop by. There was a particular night that felt like the tilt in the world's axis, though in the moment it landed like a small ordinary event. Jonah had been arguing with his coach and had left in a storm of quiet fury. He came home sulky and raw, and he lay across the sofa and asked, with a voice that had been eroded by fatigue, whether he could sleep there. I patted the cushion beside me, and without thinking I patted the space as if it had always been a place to land. He curled inward like someone making room for himself in the world, and somehow our bodies fit. His temple rested against my collarbone, and I felt, with the twin terror and relief of a confession, that I was willing to be the harbor he chose when storms came. In the small hours, the line between habit and desire blurred. Jonah, who often spoke physically before he could parse a feeling into language, reached for my hand as if it were something he tended in the dark. His fingers found mine and sought the topology of my palm, like a cartographer rediscovering a coastline. He did not squeeze hard. The touch was slow and exploratory, as if he were afraid a sudden pressure would break the spell. I answered by sliding my fingers between his and letting the pressure be an affirmation. We lay like that for a long time, 2 heartbeats calling across a small map, until the light began to gray and the city started to breathe again. You learn, when you keep watch over someone's small rituals, the dumb things that become garlands of meaning. Jonah had a way of tucking his feet under him, left over right, and when he did it, his calf would occasionally brush my shin. He had a habit of chewing his lower lip when he was thinking, a quick private nervousness. He had tiny shadows under his eyes from training, and he would lock the door twice when he left, so he could make sure the house was as it had been when he arrived. I held each of these things as if they were prayers, small acts of devotion I could not confess. The fear of ruining a friendship is an animal that lives in the chest, gnawing silently at certainty. Every small escalation brought with it a calculus of risk, a look held too long, a hand placed in a place that could be read as comfort or as claim, a kiss that might be possible if given an inch. I practiced reticence, tried to stem the tide of meaning I was assigning to Jonah's gestures. I told myself the only honest thing was to observe and to wait, to offer comfort and no demand. It was both cowardice and reverence, a quiet protection of the fragile architecture of what we had. The first time we talked about the possibility of something more, it was not in a flourish but a fragment of a sentence threaded into a long explanation of something else entirely. Jonah, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a towel over his head, said with a voice like a stone released into water that he sometimes thought about what it would mean to be known. He did not say this as a query addressed to me, nor was it a confession. It was a thought released and allowed to float. I answered poorly at first, idiotically, saying something about weather and seasons, and he laughed that low laugh and tucked his head deeper into the towel as if to hide his listenability. The ritual, over months, developed its own grammar. There were Sundays where the television would be low and Aaron would bring a salad bowl that was more than a salad and less than a peace offering. We invented small codes, a kiss on the top of the head that meant you were tired and wanted quiet. A hand draped across the ribs was not sexual so much as a declaration of candid proximity. The gray area grew until it resembled a room we could both enter and exit without being questioned. Yet ambiguity is a kind of tyranny. Living in the liminal kept me both safe and suspended. I had the comfort of proximity and the terror that any single misread act could dismantle the safety net. There were evenings when I wanted to scream into the thickness of the night that I loved Jonah the way one might love the sea. Wide, inevitable, and indifferent to the lightness of human plans. I never did. Instead, I became practiced at the art of being present, of letting healing action proceed, named truth. The crossing arrived the night Aaron went home early because his mother was ill and he had to drive 2 towns over. He texted an apology in a constellation of words and left the apartment in that soft, abrupt way of someone who was both giving space and taking it. Jonah, who had eaten too little and practiced too hard, was unusually restless and asked to sit with me on the bed for a little while. He flopped beside me and in the half-dark made a sound that was neither demand nor request. It was an opening. I remember, in that moment, the scene as a photograph that took years to develop. Jonah's profile against the dim light, the steady incline of his brow, the way his fingers clenched then relaxed on the duvet. He turned to me, and in the way athletes sometimes did after a match, when wounds were both raw and honest, he asked, quietly, whether it would be okay if he kissed me. The question was so tender that it could have been swallowed by the curtains, but it lingered almost like a benediction. I felt something inside me that had been reinforcing a wall for years melt in the heat of his sincerity. I said yes. The word was low, almost a whisper, and when our mouths met, it was not the cinematic capitalization one expects in a lifetime of stories. It was slow and precise, like an agreement between 2 people who had been orbiting each other and finally chose to collide and be different. There was a delicious and terrifying shock, a recognition that whatever steps followed would be complicated and honest. When Jonah drew back, he looked at me with a question lodged in his eyes, as if he had asked permission and now needed to know what the answer would obligate him to. What happened next was not the fever of melodrama, but the patient, careful work of 2 people reconfiguring their boundary markers. We spoke in small sentences that night, more about the mechanics of how we would continue than the poetry of what had become. Jonah admitted that he had been thinking about it for a long time, that he had been terrified of losing the structure we had. I confessed that the fear had been mutual and that I had been keeping a private anthology of moments I could not bring myself to publish. Then came the fallout, not the cinematic falling out, but the slow, inward argument that happens when fears and desires collide in rooms where you thought you had furniture arranged. Aaron came back after a series of texts that fizzed with the static of an upset, and the 3 of us sat at the kitchen table with the soft glow of the lamp making our faces into lamps of their own. He looked at us in a way that made me see my own choices reflected back as fragile emissaries. We had to speak to pry open the hermetic seals of what we had been operating under. The conversation that followed was messy and honest. Aaron asked questions that hovered like thrown pebbles. Did I feel excluded? Had there been a betrayal? Did we love him less because we loved this other way? We answered with halting honesty. I told him, in the way of someone trying to navigate a delicate crevice, that my love for him as friend was not a lesser fire but one that blazed on different wood. Jonah, who had been so practiced in moving through spaces with the assumption of plausible deniability, faltered and then found his footing in directness. He apologized for not speaking sooner and admitted his fear that saying it aloud would cost him what he could not bear to lose. There was a silence that followed speaking, the attentive kind that can either break like glass or hold like bridled wood. Aaron cried quietly and with a sound that came from some deep, unguessed place, and for a moment I thought the floor would open and ask us to name ourselves on the other side. He was hurt, yes, but not only for himself. He was hurt for the structure of a life that had been cooperative and predictable, and for the sudden rearrangement of the geography of his evenings. He worried about the practicalities and the amorphous future. We could not soothe him with platitudes. We could only offer persistent, patient presence. In the weeks that followed, the relationship architecture rearranged itself with deliberate tenderness. We negotiated everything as if we were moving into a new city. Boundaries, nights, expectations, the logistics of someone staying over and someone else needing their own space. There were agreements about how to check in when feelings grew, about how to make room for jealousy without letting it colonize the home. Aaron practiced asking not in accusation but in curiosity, and Jonah learned the language of consent beyond bedrooms, how to apologize without expecting amnesty. There was, for a while, an uneasy equilibrium. I learned that love is not only the passage toward proximity, but the arduous work of listening, of noticing when another's breathing has changed, and asking what it needed. We began to practice what honesty meant when it was not a sword but a tool, precise, useful, and capable of making a home livable for more than one person. There were moments when a curl of jealousy flared and then ebbed because we chose to speak about it rather than allow it to calcify into resentment. But there was also a time of withdrawal, a season of testing where Jonah went quiet and retreated into himself as if he were trying to see who he was without the comforting pressure of two others. He played less, trained more, and when he did return he came back with a distance that made our apartment feel like the first time you open a book you loved and find the pages slightly altered. I could sense him trying to reconcile a new self with the old one, and my own fear sharpened into a quiet, hard-edge anxiety that I protected with gentle patience. It was Aaron who finally confronted us with a clarity that felt like a lantern in fog. He called me aside in the hallway one night when the air felt close and said, very simply, that he needed to know we were certain. He was not asking for prophecies. He was asking for the concrete. Did we see ourselves staying here, sharing this life? I listened and felt the swell of my own longing and fear mix into a single sense of need. I told him I did see it, that my affection for both of them had reformed into a new constellation where none of us were satellites alone. Jonah, who had been picking at the hem of his sweater in the kitchen, put down the mug he was washing and said he wanted the same thing. We were, in that admission, both terrified and liberated. The terror came from the weight of choice and consequence. The liberation came from the relief that the unspoken had been given language and was no longer a rumor between us. For a long time after that, we learned together how to share a life that had once been linear and had become a braided thread. There were domestic rhythms that took on the texture of a prayer. We learned to divide chores in a way that acknowledged our strengths and made peace with our weaknesses. I took photographs of the living room window in the mornings, when the light carved the same paths across the floor, and spread those prints in the hallway so each of us could see the same dawn. Aaron learned to cook stew with less smoke and more patience. Jonah learned to hang his jacket where it could breathe rather than on the back of a chair. We had rituals of making space that were not performative, but formative. Sexuality, for me, had been a long-neglected room with wallpaper I had never chosen. I had always told myself I liked women because it had been the simplest explanation for the life I was living. But the truth is stubborn and patient and will wait until you are ready to look at it. In allowing myself to be claimed as a possible harbor by Jonah, I learned how flexible desire could be, and how much of it had less to do with gender than with intimacy. With the way someone looked at you and saw what you had been shielding. I did not lose the memory of other lovers but learned to reframe it, to see it as practice for a greater honesty. We did not live in continuous euphoria. Life is not a film with a single climactic montage. There were bad days and chores neglected and mornings when we had the tempers of people who had not yet built rituals to smooth the corrugation of living in a small space together. There were fights about boundaries, about the way Jonah could be careless with a kitchen knife, about the time Aaron accidentally threw out a batch of photos I had meant to keep. We argued like adults do when they want to be heard and not demolished. We made amends with small acts, coffee left on the bedside table, a note on the fridge that said nothing more than "I'm here when you return." Jealousy surfaced, as it does in any relationship that complicates itself beyond simple exclusivity, but it was softer than I had feared. It arrived as a question: who did you lean on when I was not there? We learned to answer it not with possessiveness but with patience. Jonah learned to say when he needed attention, and Aaron learned to say when his reserves had been drained. I learned, in many small incidents, how to be generous without sacrificing my own needs, how to ask for what I wanted without making it a demand. Intimacy in our household was mostly quiet. We discovered that tenderness could be expressed through small everyday acts, folding someone's shirt the way they liked it, sharing a blanket when one of us had a nightmare, braiding a necklace of small favors that accumulated into security. When we lay in bed, sometimes all three of us would be interlaced in a way that looked like a map of everything we'd once feared to lose. In those moments, the aches of our previous lives, loneliness, the dread of violating friendships felt like distant weather. There were nights when the past intruded like a stubborn tide. An ex of Aaron's would call and ask questions that were full of old habits. A coach would demand unreasonable things of Jonah, and his mind would fly off into a defensive mode that kept him from hearing the voices of the present. I had my own ghosts in the form of exes who had asked me to be more like them, as if my shape could be remolded into what they wanted. Each echo required new conversations, new patient care, new reminders that what we had now deserved protection and tending. The most honest conversation, the one that made the story feel complete in a way that domesticity alone could not, came one rain-soaked evening when we sat on the floor surrounded by the detritus of a life we had accumulated. Books, photographs, a pair of mismatched socks, a soccer ball that Jonah insisted on keeping in the hallway. We were not dramatic about it. Conversations that matter most rarely are. We spoke about fear and hope, about what it would mean to stay together in a world that had not always shown us grace. Jonah admitted he had been afraid of being someone who used others to stave off loneliness, and that the more he examined his motives, the more he feared that loving two people would somehow be a dilution. Aaron confessed he had worried he would be displaced, as if love were a fixed pie that could only be tasted in one form. I told them both, in a voice that trembled with the weight of unshed years, that I had once built a life out of comfortable approximations, and that what scared me now was not loving enough, but the possibility of losing the safety we had created by being tentative. We promised to keep asking questions. We promised to keep the lines between us open, to practice consent not only in bed but in the spaces where daily life demanded renegotiation. We promised to accept that some days would be messy and others would be quietly perfect, and that the sum of them would be something that felt like home. The promises were not romantic in a way that required currency. They were functional, like good plumbing and strong windows, essential for a shelter to endure storms. In the years that followed, we built a home not of walls but of rituals and shared care. We decorated the hallway with prints of places I had photographed and Jonah had liked, and Aaron hung his grandmother's dish in the kitchen where it could catch the light. We adopted a cat that chose us with all the diplomatic precision of a monarch choosing subjects, who preferred my bed and Aaron's lap and Jonah's shoes for reasons he never explained. We learned to travel together with the tentative, unspoken rules of people discovering territory. We would take turns choosing destinations. Jonah liked beaches because they felt like open fields. Aaron loved old cities for their soft architecture, and I preferred places where light gave things a deliberate shape. We learned to negotiate sleeping arrangements and bathroom times, and who got to read on long flights and who fell asleep first. On a moonlit morning in a coastal town, we shared coffee on a balcony and realized, quietly, that the world had not diminished by our love but had widened. The fear that I had carried that loving two people would fracture rather than expand my heart proved to be an old, small thing. My love for Jonah was not a subtraction of my love for Aaron. It was a different shade and texture. It bent the light differently but did not erase the other. We found ways to honor difference: intimate nights reserved for two when one needed space, dinners where all three of us were present, and politics and trivialities were allowed to wander without consequence, and solitary mornings where each of us could be a single figure moving through our own private rituals. We encountered judgments in the world that sometimes felt like wind against a window. Strangers asked questions that were at once clumsy and invasive. Friends from college who had known us as roommates took time to learn that affection could be plural rather than singular. But we met those questions with patient explanation and with the more powerful work of simply living our lives in a steady, unperformative way. People changed slowly when they saw the ordinary ways we took care of each other. There were days when the choreography of caring turned into friction. Jonah's restlessness sometimes felt like a tremor beneath the floor. Aaron's sensitivity could feel like glass if I handled it without awareness. I misstepped and made mistakes and begged for forgiveness with the humility of someone who had once lost far too easily and had learned the price of negligence. The forgiveness we practiced was not always instantaneous. It was an act of return that required time and consistency. Now, looking back, The small rituals we once used to hold the ambiguity of our relationships had blossomed into a language that required no translator. A hand on the small of someone's back at night said, "I will be here." A shared sweater on a cold dawn said, "You belong." A note left under a coffee mug saying, "Make sure to eat," carried weight. We became caregivers to one another in ways mundane and sacred. I remember a winter morning years later when Jonas, Aaron, and I sat in the kitchen with an economy of movement that comes from long intimacy. The kettle hissed, and the light from the window painted a small rectangle of warmth on the linoleum. Jonah was humming to himself as he buttered toast. Aaron was flipping through a magazine he had read 100 times. And I sat with a camera I had almost entirely given up dragging along to parties because I no longer needed to document everything in order to understand it. I took a photograph of them both without asking because my impulse had turned devotional to save the arrangement of their profiles in the amber light. Sometimes people imagine polyamory as a grand experiment or a rebellion. For us, it was a practical reconfiguration of the heart to accommodate more than one domestic truth. It required the same work as a monogamous relationship: the communication, the bodywork of letting go and stepping up, the art of patience. It was, above all, a slow labor of learning how to be generous without losing the capacity for self-care. We marked anniversaries quietly. We did not have big ceremonies or elaborate vows. We celebrated the night Jonah scored the winning goal in a local cup by making stew and wearing the same ridiculous hats we had bought to keep warm during the match. We celebrated Aaron getting a promotion with a cake that leaned to one side because we had laughed too much to concentrate on the frosting. We celebrated small mercies like the day my lungs felt less tight after a bout of illness and they hovered over me like guardians. The healing that came through our love felt not like a thunderclap but like gradual mending, the stitchwork of someone learning to sew a fabric back together in a way that honored the new shape of the garment. Where I had once kept my feelings tidy and supervised by the polite rules of friendship, I now let tenderness permeate the edges of my days. I did not become other people's property. I became someone who had permission to ask for help and to offer it in equal measure. There were quiet rituals that felt like sacrament. On certain nights, we would take turns telling stories that had once hung like ornaments in the rooms of our private pasts. Jonah would tell me about the first time he played in a crowd that had cheered for him, and his voice would be soft with remembered greed. Aaron would tell the story of his grandmother teaching him how to iron a shirt with the patient care of a woman who had known the ritual of preparing for the world by smoothing it. I would tell of my first camera, found and cheap, and how I learned to look at light as a friend. Sometimes when the city was particularly quiet and the apartment seemed to inhale and exhale with the weather, we would allow ourselves to be entirely unstructured. We would stay in bed for long hours, reading, talking, and touching in the gentlest ways. In those stalled hours, I learned the exact slope of Jonah's jaw when he slept and the way Aaron's palms fit into the hollow of my back. I learned how to measure love not by grand gestures, but by the utility of care, someone making sure to iron the collar properly because the other had a meeting. It did not make us immune to the world's small cruelties, but it made us resilient. There were mornings when one of us would leave the apartment with the weight of the day already settled on his shoulders, and the other two would make small notes in the journal we kept on the coffee table so that when he returned, he would find solace in the evidence of being remembered. Those handwritten things, an "I love you," an "I'm proud of you," a "remember to breathe" garnered power because they were quotidian artifacts of affection. In the winter when the city snowed and the world went slick and soft, Aaron grew ill and had to go home to his family for an extended period. We worried, of course, about how the geography of absence would bend us, but in that pause, Jonah and I learned new ways of being in relation. Jonah learned to cook proper soup that did not taste like compromise. I learned to say the word alone without it meaning being lonely. We practiced patience with the knowledge that someone could be absent and their absence did not mean erasure. When Aaron returned, it was with a gentle, weary gratitude, like someone who had been out in a storm and found that the house had been kept tidy. The three of us melded into a rhythm until the triptych of our daily lives became normalized outwardly and remained tenderly wild inside. Friends who had once known us as roommates now met us as a unit, no longer guessing about the shape of our affections. It took time, as all good settlements do, but the news in our bodies that we were chosen and choosing each other resonated more loudly than any gossip. Now, when people ask me how I realized I was not who I thought I was, I tell them that it was not an unveiling so much as an opening. The world had always been larger than the categories I had been taught to inhabit. It was Jonah's hand in mine on the couch in late winter, and Aaron's patient questions at the kitchen table, and the smallness of the domestic gestures that taught me to speak a clearer truth. It was the recognition that love was not a fixed geometry, but an evolving architecture you built with the people who showed up and stayed. Sometimes I still think of my former life as a series of sepia photographs, beautiful but limited by the borders of their frames. I do not regret those images. They taught me to see edges and light, and to appreciate the tenderness of small things. But there is now color where there was once only technique, and the palette is more complicated and more honest for it. I am not the same man who once lived by neat labels, and that is not a loss, it is an unexpected expansion. We have not remedied the world of its indifference, nor banished the loneliness that can visit even the most crowded rooms. But we have learned to make a harbor from 3 bodies and 3 hearts that decided, after much negotiation, that safety could be a shared structure. There was terror in the admission of desire, in risking friendship for something tender and unnamed. But the relief afterward was quiet and vast. We learned that vulnerability was not an erosion but a strengthening. We learned how to be present and how to accept presence in return. There were practicalities, too, that required attention. Legal considerations and insurance papers that demanded a language for our partnership, and the awkwardness of explaining to bureaucrats what constituted our household. We soldiered through the forms and appointments and wrote our names in that small ledger that felt like a treaty. That documentation was not an end in itself, but a foundation on which we could build future certainties. The simplest moments remain, in the end, the most telling. I remember the way Jonah would brush crumbs off the counter and place them into an old tin like a small sacrament. I remember Aaron folding my scarf and placing it in a drawer with such meticulous care that I felt adored. I remember how, when I was sick, they took turns making tea and watched old black and white films with me when I wanted to hear other people's lives for a while. Those events, not the dramatic ones, are what hold the shape of our days. On a summer evening, some time later, we hosted a small dinner for friends. The living room was lit with string lights that made everything forgiving, and I walked from guest to guest with a camera because I wanted to capture the ease of it. Jonah argued the toss of a salad with an infuriating expertise, while Aaron told a story about an early job, and the hum of laughter made a kind of canopy over our heads. In the pause between courses, I watched them both from the kitchen doorway and felt that particular tenderness that comes when you understand that you have been chosen by the people you love. I had once been terrified of losing friendship for love, but I had learned that risk is a form of offering, and that boundaries are not just walls but doorways. We had been afraid and earnest and foolish and patient. We had learned how to say sorry and to repair without tallying debts. We had learned that home was less a place and more a practice, of being attentive, of returning, of making room. The seasons rolled as they do, and with them came small, unremarkable certainties. Jonas would tie his shoelaces in a particular way before a match. Aaron would trace his thumb across the rim of his coffee cup when he was thinking. They are like bookmarks in the book of us. They marked progress, not the end of anything, because love is not a climactic end, but a daily choosing. We chose each other repeatedly in the small ways that make a life. In the quiet hours of my life now, when the city is soft and the apartment hums with a contentment that is not always loud but is persistent, I sometimes put my head on a pillow and think of the first time Jonah laid his temple against my collarbone and asked to be allowed to kiss me. The memory is not a single point, but a field of light that has continued to spread like the first flush of dawn across a long day. It taught me to expand my maps, to unlearn the simplicity I had once believed in, and to accept that the heart is capable of many geometries. There is a final kind of peace I did not expect. It is not resolved in the denial of complexity, but rather in the tender acceptance of it. We are not perfect people sharing a perfect arrangement. We are 3 flawed hearts that take up a shared space and choose, with frequent humility and abundant care, to shelter each other. The romance of it is mundane and precise. The making of tea, the folding of shirts, kisses in the kitchen doorway, the reading of old letters aloud, and the laughing that follows when memories betray us by softening. One evening, a few years after that first tentative kiss, we stood in the hallway and watched the light diminish. There was, without grand fanfare, a small hand on my back and another on my chest, and the three of us breathed together as if the rhythm of us could be measured. I felt then the gentle, encompassing harbor we had built, not a fortress, but a place where weather could be endured and where storms were likely to be met, with blankets and a steady hand. There are millions of photographs of lovers who look heroic in the way they carry their passion. Ours would not make the same postcard. It would be a photograph of a kitchen window with 3 mugs on the sill, of a pair of sneakers by the door, of a cat sleeping on a stack of magazines. These images may not seem like the stuff of epics, but they are entire worlds to me. If I have learned anything, it is this: life hands you ordinary miracles if you keep your hands open and your eyes soft. The transformation from thinking I liked women because that was what I thought was expected, to recognizing that my heart had always been flexible and waiting for specific tenderness, was not sudden but gradual and reverent. It required the courage to risk friendship, the capacity to speak when silence would have been easier, and the willingness to accept that love could be offered and kept in more than one place. And so we continued. A small, unconventional family that learned how to hold each other steady. We were not a spectacle. We were a practice. We were a promise that was renewed every morning at the stove when someone stirred the pot, every evening when a hand drifted to a knee without asking, and every midnight when the lights dimmed and breaths synchronized in that small domestic concert of being. There were days when I still felt ashamed of the years I had spent mislabeling myself, but shame is a thin thing when it is replaced by acknowledgement. I would tell whoever asked, not as an apologetic confession but as a quiet fact, that the person I had once believed I would become had been waiting patiently in plain sight. And that love sometimes arrives wearing the clothes of what you already knew, and sometimes in the shape of what you never imagined. In the end, I discovered, through their hands and presence and patient insistence, that home can be made of people and the small things they do for one another. The politics of desire and the domesticities of care blended into an ordinary, stubborn peace. There was terror and joy and sometimes grief, but there was also a constant practice of returning. We learned to pray not in grand words but in the small rituals that made it possible to be each other's harbor. The last image I want to leave is not cinematic. It is the smallest of things. Morning light slipping through blinds, 3 silhouettes at the sink washing dishes together, shoulders almost touching. A mug left by the window with a lipstick circle on it as a ghost of a laugh. A photograph on the mantel of a shore we had visited. We had become, in the quiet ways that matter most, each other's safe harbor. There are moments in life that arrive disguised as ordinary. They do not always announce themselves with trumpets. Sometimes they are the way another person tucks their chin against your shoulder in the rain and asks for refuge. Sometimes they are the slow, deliberate work of saying, "I am here," when it would be easier not to say anything at all. In learning to love Jonah, and to love Aaron, in ways that were both distinct and overlapping, I learned the most ordinary and miraculous thing of all. To let down the wall I had built and to accept that my heart had room for more than one kind of belonging. We had begun to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together.